That, I would like to move into our first segment for bio-based sector. Because the bio-based industry is so vast and is such a huge area, for every segment that we considered for hotspot evaluation and circularity definition, we first began our exercise by creating what we call the value chain map. Unfortunately, today only linear value chains exist. And linear value chains typically look at input all the way to end of life with no circularity in place. For each of these linear value chains, for each segment, we reviewed various themes covering resources, energy, emissions, water, waste generation, and what are the inefficiencies that currently exist within this linear value chain. As you would see here from a very summarized version for the bio-based sector, there are various inefficiencies right at the beginning, which is at the feedstock production, where there is lack of demand-supply balance between how much feedstock needs to be produced versus how much bioethanol production is happening in the country. At the biorefinery or the manufacturing level, there is again inefficiencies in context of how the resource efficiencies need to take place within biorefinery setup, how the energy and the emissions model need to be balanced with increasing growth in biorefineries. And finally, at the end consumer level and the end of life, there is practically no implementation of valorizing residues, bio-waste, or even changing the consumer behavior. So we have basically looked at these inefficiencies in the existing version of the linear value chain and picked them up for what we will discuss as the strategy framework and action plan. Bringing back you to this slide, and as we talked about, the next few slides will focus on how the circularity hotspots were assessed for two: sustainable feedstock production, the first hotspot, and the second hotspot, which is around valorizing residues. And I'll explain what that means as we go along. And as you would see, this is not just focused on bio-based industry, it's a cutting across for smart mobility as well as for lifestyle and services. In terms of creating circularity and bringing circular value chains to the existing linear value chains, ERM looked at three enabling factors. The first one here is creating circularity right at the design stage. This basically looks at how do you look at land use practices? What kind of crops would be best fitted for what kind of agriculture practices? For example, if you convert rubber plantation to new agriculture feedstock areas, it will have more circular impact, less land use pressure as compared to converting peatlands or rainforest. Similarly, how do you extend or rotate crops within the same land? How do you look at nutrient management? Nutrient management is something which is least talked about in context of EEC in Thailand. But if you look at some of the developing economies like Europe, which have already dominated in the space of circular economy and biomass, they faced huge challenges when it came to nutrient balance like potash and nitrogen supply for agricultural demand. The second is resource optimization. How do you look at planning your yield and balancing the land use practices accordingly? For example, what kind of ethanol production would have what kind of impact in context of waste, energy, and emissions? Looking at strategic use of what we call multi-purpose crops, and this is what means as valorizing residues, of how same crop can be reused, not just in terms of the main crop, but also the residue from the crop can be brought into the biorefineries. Similarly, how do you integrate the multi-use crops to your biorefineries by creating a circular mechanism? And then finally, recovery and reuse. How do you enable the infrastructure and supply chain to collect back the residues and connect the end of the life cycle to the input of the life cycle? Moving on to the first part, which is sustainable feedstock production. Sustainable feedstock production is a pretty big term. It essentially means energy crops that are grown on lands that do not compete for land use and do not have a negative impact on the land use practices. So that's essentially what is meant by sustainable feedstock production. Because this topic is very big, it is further divided into these 5 areas. The first three, which is essentially improving land use practices, increasing biomass production, and managing emissions from these conversions, are focused around the land use practices. What we have done in context of these 3 areas is looking at how EEC and the existing policies can promote multi-use crops, crop rotation, and promoting the use of bio-waste residues for biorefinery expansion. Nutrient balance, as I said earlier, is another important element where Thailand and EEC can take early steps to ensure that there are no lack of nutrient balance to support the growing agricultural demands. And finally, sustaining water supplies. If you look at some of the global context, one of the things that our studies focused on capturing in a lot of details is that how have these topics impacted across the globe as other economies have moved towards bio-based economies. So these are some of the data-driven aspects, and you would see from the first chart here that depending on the type of land that you use for a type of crop production, there is a huge impact in terms of emissions. Similarly, depending on the type of crop that is under agriculture, there is a huge impact on the amount of water that it consumes, which also indirectly and directly links to the weather conditions of that area. Finally, the table below, which shows the red and the greens, shows you that for the top 2 crops or the top 2 fuel outputs of ethanol produced from corn and sugarcane, which definitely have a high fuel yield value, they also have a very high impact in terms of emissions, water, fertilizer, pesticide, and energy consumption. So it is very important to look at the land use practices vis-a-vis the crop yields and planning for the expansion of agricultural produce in context of the sustainable practices. This is crucial as Thailand expands into more biofuel production, and it will also be crucial towards the next topic that we'll discuss around valorizing residues. As we talked about the gaps, you would see here a summary of the gaps assessment for the sustainable feedstock, which is our first hotspot. So we see that in terms of policy and procedures, we are already ahead. There's definitely a strong policy framework in place to support the bio-based industries, particularly the plans that have come out by AEDP, promoting the VSPPs and SPPs, the feed-in tariff systems, and the decentralization of the bio-industries are very strong mechanisms to further promote bio-industries in EC and Thailand. However, the infrastructure is still lacking. There is lack of infrastructure to collect and connect the biomass or the production to the biorefineries. Similarly, business strategies are there, but it is not replicated across industries. It's very much dominated by the national players. We see very less coming in from the private sector when it comes to bio-based industries. Partnerships are growing. Supply chain as infrastructure is challenged because most of the stakeholder conversations we had were all talking about increasing source. How do I get more feedstock, right? Technology innovation is again lacking, and in fact, it is slightly starting to pick up with initiatives from ECI, for example, with focus on sustainable aviation fuel, moving away to biofuel production from algae use, which is essentially a 3rd and a 4th generation use, and now with this program also emphasizing on valorizing 2nd generation biofuel production. With that, I would like to bring you to our next mentee question. We like to understand your feedback on what you understand or what you think are the gaps to promote bio-based industries in Thailand. Great, we're already getting some answers here. We would like to understand what are the key obstacles in your view for promoting sustainable feedstock production in Thailand. It's a multiple choice because of course challenges is not one, it's multiple. So please select as many options as you like. We would like to understand your viewpoint for promoting sustainable feedstock production. We'll give it a few seconds. I think we already have a few votes in, and mostly around policy support, infrastructure, problems of sourcing raw materials, definitely, which is a supply chain aspect, infrastructure, it's getting more votes, co-location of bioproducers to biorefineries. This is something which is definitely one of the aspects our stakeholders also talked about. It's interesting that a lot of votes have come, or significant amount of votes have come around policy support. So if you notice that in our gap assessment, we are providing it as green, which means that already there are a number of policies in place. However, the gap essentially is in understanding and articulating of these policies towards the public and private sector, more towards the private sector. So this you would see coming together in the action plan, that how the existing policies which are already there can be better articulated and better reached out to the private sector for leveraging. So it's not that the policies are not there or the incentives are not there. It's more how the private sector is not able to use some of these policies for expanding their bio-based business. Great, we actually have the highest vote in context of policy and infrastructure. So we'll talk more about this particular gap. In fact, this is a very big perceived gap in terms of policy support. While more policies are required, but the existing policies that are there in context of decentralization of biorefineries are potentially requiring more support in terms of awareness and capability building. With that, we will move to the next segment. Okay. In this question, we are wanting your opinion on understanding what are the key obstacles for valorizing residues. While we'll talk a little bit about valorizing in the next section, what do you think are the key obstacles for reusing of waste from the bio-based industries and diverting it back to biorefineries as a feedstock? The Menti codes are given on the screen above. We already have a few votes in here in terms of the current laws and regulation. Lack of business strategy, lack of international and local partnerships, current laws. So while we move on to talk about the valorizing residues, I would like you all to keep in mind the results from these two questions. When we talk about sustainable feedstock production, you saw that a lot of votes have come around policies and infrastructure. And we talked about valorizing residues, a lot of votes have come around policy and infrastructure. So as I said, in context of sustainable feedstock production, there is definitely existing policies, but the adoption rate is low. But infrastructure and supply chain is definitely a gap that has been confirmed by the stakeholder interactions in EEC. However, now as we move to valorizing residues, and allow me to explain a little bit about this topic, you will see that here the gaps exist more in terms of policies rather than the infrastructure, because this is a topic which is very new to EEC and to Thailand. So what does valorizing residues even mean? Valorizing residues essentially is a term coined for multi-purpose crops, which means that if I am looking at rice cultivation, I'm not just using rice as a consumer product, but I'm also looking at the rice straw as one of my feedstock options. If I'm looking at cassava for biofuel production, I'm also looking at the roots of cassava for an alternative feedstock production. So it essentially focuses on the same crops, but it uses its additional crop elements as an input to the biorefineries as an additional feedstock usage. This concept is called second generation biofuel production. First generation focuses on the primary crops, which is sugarcane, cassava, but the second generation moves away and reduces the pressure on the first generation and focuses on roots, straws, and the residues that are left from agriculture. What is very interesting for Thailand is that based on the data collected from almost 51 provinces in Thailand, there are some highlights given on this slide. For example, there is as much rice straw left, which can produce crude oil equivalent of 3,000 kilotons per year, powering almost 800 megawatts, but it is unutilized. Similarly, there is as much cassava roots left, which can power up to 152 megawatt, which is equivalent to 20% efficiency of a power plant for 350 days a year. However, this is left unused. So, this database, which is internal to Thailand and accessible to all, is a very difficult database to interpret, right? So when our analysts went into this database, we had to extract the data and analyze the data. But what we found is that Thailand has enough resources when it comes to second generation biofuel production. However, all of these resources are left unused. Now, on the other hand side, when you look at how valorizing residues is used in a global context, it is not just used for only biofuel production, but these residues are diverted into other industries. For example, clothing, cars used as car material, the clothing material in cars, cosmetics, or even in pharmaceutical industries. So across the world, the bio-based residues are already used for second generation fuel production, and alternatively, they're also used for other industries. And hence, this particular hotspot is a very important and crucial for Thailand in context of the increasing biofuel demand, as well as the pressure on land use from the primary crops. In global context, this has been a growing challenge, but certain economies are moving very fast on adopting this particular circularity hotspot. The key is that because the same type of crops are in demand for the same type of outputs, it is creating a supply bubble. That means I would need more and more cassava or sugarcane for primary production of ethanol. However, I would go on cultivating more of cassava, thereby creating pressure on the land use and adopting unsustainable agricultural practices. If you look at some examples, very interesting examples around how residues have been used across the world. For example, Pinatex is a textile that is created from pineapple residues. Tomato fibers are being used for packaging. Shell-based residues are used in chitin production for cosmetics. So these are just some examples that in the next wave can also be utilized for Thailand in terms of leveraging that unused bio-based residues that is sitting untapped. And as I said, alternative biomass and valorizing residues is crucial for bio-waste management as well. And this can be seen across the world with a lot of best case examples where husk, leaves, and even tree-based residues are being used for creating cellulosic ethanol. It also gives Thailand a number of opportunities for investment, particularly in renewable energy, organic fertilizers, research and development. Coming to the gaps, and this is where you will start seeing some correlation between feedstock and valorizing residues. Unlike the feedstock production, in context of valorizing residues, we are seeing that the policy is a big challenge. Currently, there are no policies in place which promotes using valorizing residues as a feedstock or an alternative feedstock option in biorefineries. The processes are there, primarily driven by local players like Metropole, who are already in process of valorizing their residues. Infrastructure, big gap. There are no infrastructures in place, and this is a big gap in terms of bringing more collection, more sorting, and more diversion of these waste residues into biorefineries. Business strategy is somehow developing because the national players in Thailand are already starting to look at the alternative use of residues. Partnerships are definitely lacking because not a lot of public private partnerships are currently existing in the field of valorizing residues. Supply chain as infrastructure is also a gap. Technology innovation is somewhat starting, particularly as I said, in context of sustainable aviation, where algae is used. However, also in second generation feedstock, we can see some examples from the national players to use the current residues like cassava roots. However, there is a gap in culture as well in terms of looking at these bioresidues as alternative options for not just fuel production, but also for consumer goods. Okay, so we're back at this question. In fact, this question was supposed to come in after the gaps, but it happens. Technology sometimes does give us some twist. So now, as you've already looked at what is valorizing residues and how valorizing residues is slightly different from sustainable feedstock production, we welcome you to vote again on this question if you think that your responses might have changed. We'll just give it 30 seconds to see if the voting results now change on this question. Okay, so I think as we agreed that the policies and the infrastructure is a big gap when it comes to valorizing residues. And that has also come up pretty clear in the voting results. Taking you to the next section. Coming to the circularity promotion strategy. So as we showed you, the 4 pillars that create the circular economy framework for Thailand, we have leveraged the same to say what will be EECO's circularity investment promotion strategy. And this is focused on the 2 hotspots that we just looked at, valorizing bio-waste residues and sustainable bioproduction. The first is design for circularity. Here, we are focused on policy and incentives framework and creating additional tax rebates and incentives to reduce the dependency on first generation biofuels. Rethinking of business models, where it is very much required for ECO to unlock the value sitting in residues and bio-waste, and creating industrial symbiosis and permit efficiencies to leverage the existing policies and divert it for fast growth. Collaborations, connected supply chains would be crucial for bringing in the cross collaboration from where the produce is happening, where waste are generated, and then bringing it back to the refineries. And finally, tech enabling the supply and demand. How does a biorefinery get to know that there is available feedstock as cassava roots or rice straws that I can bring in for my fuel production? Create a technology platform using startups, technology partners that can help you connect the demand and supply side of bio-based industries. So based on those factors that we showed you, we already have some results here, but please feel free to start voting. What, in your opinion, needs to be prioritized for ECO's circularity investment promotion strategy for bio-based sector? First, as we discussed, is the focused policy and incentive framework, tax rebates, focusing on investment to unlock the second generation feedstock productions, industrial symbiosis, connected supply chains, scaling up biorefineries, bio-based technology platform, and a digital circular economy forum. Which of these do you think would be most critical to enable circularity for EECO? Please give us your votes because this will form the basis of our action plans as well. Currently, there are very high votes for two of these, which is focused policy incentives. We completely agree and align to this. There's definitely a need for more policy and incentives for valorizing of residues and the technology platforms to support the demand-supply connection. We're also seeing good votes for tax rebates and incentives. We'll give it a few more seconds for you guys to vote. Also the team on Zoom. Connected supply chains, definitely. Still policy, incentives, tax rebate, and bio-based technology platform in the lead. And maybe a few more before we close out. Great. I think we are very aligned with our study results are very aligned with what you think. The focus policy and incentive framework is a must-have, along with tax rebates and incentives to promote second generation biofuels, third generation, and even fourth generation, and bio-based technology platform. With that, let's move to the next segment. So let's come to the most important element, which is the action plan and the relevant organizations. We've divided our action plan into 4 buckets. The first one is technology support. What you will see here now is that we have prioritized these action plans over the next 3 phases. The first phase, which is up to 6 months, the next phase of 6 to 12 months, and the third phase, which will move up to a year or more. The first and foremost action plan is to launch feasibility study for understanding where agricultural residues are sitting, in how much quantity, and what is the potential. The numbers I gave you around rice straws and cassava roots is just an example. There is enough untapped potential sitting in Thailand around biomass residues across the country, which can be used by the biorefineries and for scale up of fuel production. However, today, private sector, even public sector, or the investors do not know where to go and where to hunt for these alternative feedstock. So the first action plan is to create a very detailed guidance for these alternative feedstocks, understand the barriers, understand the seasonality, right? Which season, which crop type would be available, which kind of residue can I use? And create an international vendor ecosystem for the investors and players to understand and tap.
So we have a technical glitch. So we need to fix the glitch. So apologies for all participants. So please give us 5 minutes to fix the technical glitch.
We will start from the action plan and relevant organizations. Ms. Prati, please.
Thank you. Apologies for that little technical error. We'll restart from the most important aspect, which is the action plan and what action plans have been prioritized for EEC to promote bio-based industry. The first segment for the action plan is technology support. Here, the first action is to create a feasibility study for different agricultural residues focused on two industries, chemicals and consumer goods. This basically links to our point that there is a large amount of untapped bio-based resources in Thailand. However, the users, the consumers, the industries do not have a good idea of how to use these residues, be it for primary fuel production or diverting them for secondary or third generation fuel production. Hence, EEC will focus on creating a guidance for the agricultural residues for the industries, identifying the quantums, the volumes, sources, key barriers, and also seasonality for these crop-based residues. EEC will also support on working towards a revision in AEDP to support additional policy framework and incentives to promote second and third generation fuel production in Thailand. Currently, AEDP has been instrumental in supporting the policy frameworks for the first generation fuel and increased biorefineries implementation. However, it needs to further move into a direction of providing incentives and tax rebates for second and third generation fuel production as well. The next action is focused on launching an industrial guidelines for helping industries understand the technology implications and the feedstock specifications for using residues for three focus industries: bioplastics, biochemicals, and consumer goods. This guideline would focus on how value-added services can be created by diverting these residues into industrial use. The next action plan is focused on a pilot scale production in the EEC region for strategic use of multi-purpose crops, or what we call valorizing crop residues, focused on the top three residue types, which is cassava roots, sugarcane bagasse, and rice straws. The next one, also a very important one, would be to design and launch Thailand's Bioeconomy Performance Report. With the increasing amount of advancement around the bio-based industries, it is very important that a performance report can be published, not just at the national level, but can be orchestrated at a global level in context of showing what are the goals and how Thailand is progressing against these goals for the bio-based industries. The second segment for the action plan is policy and regulatory enablement. Here, the first action plan is to define a policy framework for second generation biofuel production in Thailand, covering different kind of feedstocks, moving away from the primary crops and focusing on lignocellulose feedstock to municipal and bio-waste options as well. Developing and harmonizing the collection process, or what we call the infrastructure and supply chain, to promote the use of residues, bio-waste, would be a focus of this action plan. Next will be to create a one-stop service, and this links to the gaps in understanding the policies that you saw in sustainable feedstock. So as we said earlier, not that policies don't exist. Policies exist, but there is a gap in adopting the policies. So the action plan here focuses on simplifying the policy regulation, making it easy to understand and interpret, and also creating a one-stop portal for accessing all permits, rebates, tax incentives for any new investor who wants to enter EEC or Thailand for bio-based industries. Introducing a tax incentive plan for promoting second and third generation biofuel, specifically for the aviation and automotive segment, would be the next action plan. The next category of the action plan focuses on skill development and awareness, which is a very crucial bucket for the overall segment. The first action here is to develop a national skill development program, which will help in industries and supply chain players to understand how waste needs to be collected, from where, what kind of sorting practices and principles need to be adopted, and how this skill needs to be transferred to the SPPs, or the small power producers, and the VSPPs, or the very small power producers, which are currently very critical in the bio-based industries. This will also focus as a phase 1 campaign on designing and launching a series of campaigns for educating and imparting people to understand about valorizing residues, focused on promoting second and third generation fuel production. The phase 2 campaign of the skill development will focus on valorizing residues and diverting biomass to other industrial segments like consumer goods, biochemicals, and bioplastics. So the phase 1, we talked about focusing on how second generation fuel can be produced, thereby reducing the pressure on first generation fuels and first generation crops. And the phase 2 of this campaign would focus on how these residues can also be diverted to other industrial segments like biochemicals, consumer goods, and bioplastics. Next, under this bucket would be to design and launch a series of knowledge sharing sessions like this and more, where national and international players can come together, discuss about new technologies to help reduce the pressure on first generation crops, improvise land use practices, and valorizing residues. And finally, the fourth pillar of action plan is around digital enablement. Here, we are recommending to create Thailand's first bioeconomy commercial trading platform to boost the private players to enter the biofuel production in Thailand. Currently dominated by national players, the play from private sector and private investors is very limited. This bioeconomy commercial trading platform will connect private players, SPPs, and VSPPs to bio-based residues, small agricultural producers, and create commercial and viable models to extend the supply chain. This will further extend into creating what we call as the bioeconomy supply-demand digital platform. The digital platform will connect the supply and the demand side, the producer to the consumer. And this will also enable price sensitivities, price mechanism, bidding structures to come in place for getting alternative feedstocks for running and scaling up biorefineries. And lastly, the Thailand Digital Circular Economy platform will be a one-stop platform that enables policies and incentives to be linked to valorizing residues, sustainable crop production, having industrial guidelines in place for leveraging residues like in different industries of biochemicals and bioplastics, having recorded knowledge-based sessions, technical sessions, capability building sessions in place for new investors, small players, private sectors, and creating a repository for international best practices and case studies, global case studies, for understanding how bioresidues have been used in different industrial segments. So to summarize, our action plan for EECO is focused on 4 segments: technologies, enabling the bioeconomy through a digital platform. And all the different logos that you see here on the slide will be the ecosystem of collaboration and partners that will help implement these action plans. With that, we come to a very important segment, and we would like you to help us rank your idea about these action plans. We talked about various support action plans to promote the bio-based industries in Thailand. Please use your Menti code to rate against these different options of which one do you feel would be the most important action plan to prioritize for the bio-based segment in Thailand. We'll give it a few minutes.
So the question is that who is the target user for biofuel? Industrial facility is cell-based, but on ethylene-based acetyl farm. In the field, converting biomass to biogas.
That's a great question coming up on the chat. The target user for biofuels, all the EEC sectors that we talked about, right from the food industry to the smart mobility, to digital, to service and lifestyle, would be the potential users of biofuels. Currently, the use of biofuels, and in fact, even the production of biofuels, is very focused on the automotive sector with ethanol and fuel production. However, as you see, the potential of bio-based residues is unlimited. So in the future, this bio-based industries will extend to renewable options to all different segments, as mentioned here, plus more into the consumer industries, into bioplastics and biochemicals as well. It is important to note that the plastics and the chemicals industries are also moving towards leveraging bio-based feedstock. So the Shells and the Exxons of the world are looking at transforming their plastic conversions or the different waste into different kind of feedstocks. So it is important to note that bio-based residues will not just be in use for different kind of fuel production, but also for production of bioplastics and biochemicals and different kind of consumer goods. I hope that helps address the question. Okay, so as you would see here in terms of the ranking, we're still getting some votes in. We'll encourage all our audience to give us their opinion about which action plans are high in their mind. Give us a ranking. You can actually give a ranking for all the 5 options. The one that is leading here is definitely the industrial guideline. And our study and our analysis is completely aligned to it. Currently, there is abundance of bio-based residues in Thailand. However, there's a gap in understanding how to leverage these residues or divert these residues to different industries. So that will be a key action plan in terms of creating guidelines for helping use these residues. Study, of course, the study for different residues. Through our engagement, we have already created quite a good database on what kind of residues are available and what kind of international best practices are in use for diverting these residues into different kind of industries. However, a more formal study, which can be done in Thai language and can be extended to the public and private sectors, would be definitely beneficial. The ADP policy framework, that definitely stands pretty high on the agenda. And then finally, the pilot scale production project in EECI and the bioeconomy performance report. I'm surprised that it has got the lowest priority, but definitely something that will become important as we move along, because It is very important to monitor and track where we are heading, and that is the only possible through performance reporting. Great, thank you for the responses on this. The next one, we would like your responses to come on the policy and the regulatory enablers from high to low. I think we will come back to this question after the policy framework. So let's go back to our slides. Okay. So let's talk about a few examples of why we are talking about the circularity hotspots and how the world across has used some of these bio-based industries, valorizing residues for economic development. So just to give you a very high-level view, the direct job creation that happened in US or is happening right now as we speak from the bio-based segment or the biofuel industry in US has resulted in about more than 190,000 new jobs to be created in 2022. That just gives you an idea about the economic enablement that will happen with the bio-based segment by creating new jobs and bringing more revenue into the country. Interestingly, also, the total economic outputs that will contribute to the GDP, if we look at US as a case study, their expected revenue contribution from bio-based industries is expected to rise to $37 billion in the next 5 years. And the same level of economic outputs and benefits can be expected for Thailand as well. Another very interesting example for how EU has created, EU as in European Union, has launched what is called the Bio-Based Industrial Consortium. And this consortium has launched a digital platform for all the bio-based industries in the economic region. This is an available and publicly available case study. This platform, as we were talking about, connects the supply and the demand side of the value chain by bringing the producers close to the manufacturers. And a similar enablement is what we are proposing as an action plan for EECO. Coming to the last segment of our presentation for the first segment here, which was bio-based, is the policy roadmap. While there are many policies in place, very effective policies in place, it is very important that we look at what we call the Thailand bioeconomy policy, which should integrate all aspects of circularity and all aspects across the value chain. There are 3 overarching components of this policy, or the new policy that we are proposing. The first is focused around promoting biomass availability. Biomass exists, but it doesn't come to the manufacturers at the right time. So enhancing the biomass availability by bridging the gap between supply, demand, by connecting the producer to the manufacturers would be the first component of this new policy. The second component is focused on the sustainable production, which will focus on incorporating circular principles and enabling regenerative resources. This will help enable creating sustainable production practices and reducing the pressure on the existing land use resources, very crucial for scale up and growth. The third component will focus on diversifying industrial use, which is what valorizing residues focus on. So rather than focusing on the primary crops, focus on bringing new industrial use, new crops, and the residues of the crops into use for industrial products, consumer goods, bioplastics, and many more. So this is an overarching view of the new bioeconomy policy roadmap that we are proposing to come in play to promote and support the bio-based industries and promote circularity across the country. And finally, coming back to the gaps or the pillars that we outlined for the success enablement, you would see here that we have summarized what would be required for each of the pillars to be successful. When it comes to policy, it is very important to define a policy framework that supports the new generation biofuels. A central agency which will overlook implementation of circularity across the country and in EEC. New tax rebates and progressive incentives to promote bio-based industries and reduce dependency on primary fuels. Partnerships and collaborations would be a must-have. Pilot scale productions for new technology, second and third generation fuel productions. Scaling up of existing biorefineries by bringing better infrastructure and supply chains together. One of the key challenges we talked about was how co-location of biorefineries to agricultural produce would be must-have. Technology innovation will also be key. As new sources of feedstock come into play, industries will need more support on technology innovation and understanding where the field output or the fuel outputs will be maximized using what kind of fuel, what kind of feedstock residues. And finally, creating the supply chain, connecting the supply chain right from the agricultural producer, which is the farmers, all the way to the industries. With that, I would like to conclude the first segment on bio-based industries and valorizing residues. We can now take a small break and move to our next speaker for the next segment.
และสำหรับช่วงนี้นะคะจะเป็นเซสชันของQ&A
So
ค่ะ
right now we will open the floor for Q&A session.